You probably remember the sound long before you remember the actual taste. It started with that specific hiss when the pull tab finally broke the seal, followed by the sight of condensed soup sliding out in one dense, rust-colored cylinder. Then came the smell, sharp, slightly sweet, and unmistakably tomato, filling up whatever small kitchen you happen to grow up in. If you buy a can today and open it up, the experience is not quite the same. The smell is close enough to trick you at first, but the taste lands differently on your tongue. It feels thinner than it used to, sweeter in a way that does not quite sit right, and that deep, savory backbone you remember from childhood just is not carrying the same weight anymore. Campbell's never actually announced a major recipe change, and the can looks exactly the same as it always has. So, what really happened to the liquid inside? The answer is a messy mix of federal nutrition policy, a massive sugar price crisis in the early 1970s, and a flavor chemistry problem that the company spent decades trying to patch. Two separate forces hit this same formula at different times for completely different reasons, and what came out the other side is a product that shares a name with the original, but definitely does not share the same chemistry. To understand why these changes matter so much, you first have to look at what the original formula was actually doing for the company. By the 1970s, Campbell's condensed tomato soup was sitting in roughly 1 out of every 3 American kitchens. That is not just a lucky marketing estimate. It is the kind of market saturation that makes a product feel functionally invisible, as if it had always existed and always would. It showed up in school lunches and sick day routines, tucked into the back of pantries that otherwise had nothing in common with one another. Campbell's had not just sold a product, they had embedded themselves into the very structure of daily American life. Andy Warhol made this reality literal in 1962 when he put 32 Campbell's cans on a gallery wall in Los Angeles. While people argued about whether it qualified as art, the debate missed the bigger picture. Warhol was simply documenting something that was already true. The can had become a cultural shorthand, an icon so familiar that people stopped seeing it as a commercial object. It was just there, in the same way the kitchen stove was just there. What made the soup work at a chemistry level was sodium. We should not think about it the way we do now, as something to reduce or watch for health reasons. In the original formula, sodium was structural. It did 2 jobs at once, acting as a preservative to extend shelf life and also serving as a massive flavor amplifier that drove the perception of sweetness and depth from the tomatoes. Tomatoes are naturally high in glutamates, which are the compounds responsible for that savory, umami-forward flavor we all crave. Salt does not just add its own salty taste, it actually suppresses bitterness and elevates those glutamate signals. This is exactly why a well-salted tomato sauce tastes so much richer and rounder than an undersalted version made from the same ingredients. Campbell's original formula was engineered specifically around that interaction. The sodium level was not some random number. It was carefully calibrated to pull every bit of flavor from the tomato concentrate. At its historical peak, a single serving of this soup carried between 800 and 900 milligrams of sodium. That number did not raise any red flags in the 1950s or 60s because dietary salt was not a mainstream public health concern yet. But the science was starting to move, and by the late 1960s, the conversation inside federal health agencies had already shifted in a direction that would land directly on Campbell's most important product. The can looked the same on the outside, but the real changes were starting in nutrition labs far away from the factory in Camden, New Jersey. The first real signal from the federal government arrived in 1969 during the White House Conference on Food, Nutrition, and Health. This massive gathering brought together scientists, policymakers, and public health researchers to figure out how to handle malnutrition and diet-related diseases across the country. While sodium did not exactly dominate the conversation back then, The groundwork laid at that conference fed directly into the research priorities of the 1970s. This was the decade when the link between high salt intake and hypertension started gaining serious clinical backing, and the FDA began paying much closer attention to what was happening in the American pantry. By 1980, the first edition of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans told consumers explicitly to avoid eating too much sodium. That was the first time a federal nutrition document had ever used that kind of direct language. The 1985 revision only doubled down on that message, and condensed soup became an obvious target in this new environment. When a single bowl of soup can deliver nearly half a day's worth of salt in one sitting, it is hard to stay under the regulatory radar. Campbell's tried to play it safe at first by launching a dedicated low-sodium product line in 1982, but this was more of a market hedge than a real company-wide commitment. It was a way to capture health-conscious buyers without having to mess with the flagship formula that everyone already loved. However, that separation did not last very long, because informal pressure from regulators and a growing wave of media coverage about heart disease pushed the company toward making gradual reductions across its core products throughout the late 80s and into the 90s. These changes were not announced with big marketing campaigns, and the labels did not brag about a new formula. The can looked exactly the same and the name stayed the same, but the sodium levels were quietly dropping behind the scenes. The real problem was what happened to the soup once that salt was gone. When you pull sodium out of a formula that was built entirely around it, you do not just make the food healthier, you actually break the entire flavor architecture. The bitterness that salt usually suppresses starts to come forward. The perceived sweetness drops off, and the overall body of the soup begins to feel thin and watery. Food scientists call this flavor suppression reversal, and it was a massive hurdle for Campbell's because the product coming off the line did not taste like their soup anymore. To fix this, the company had to find a way to fill the gap that the missing salt left behind. High-fructose corn syrup was brought in to rebuild the sweetness, while modified food starch helped restore the texture and mouthfeel that the original formula had lost. By the time the Healthy Request line expanded between 2005 and 2010, these substitutions were not just temporary patches for a few products. They had become the new standard across almost the entire range, meaning the can still said Campbell's tomato soup, and the label still featured that iconic red and white design, but the liquid inside had been quietly re-engineered twice over. If you find an ingredient list for Campbell's tomato soup from before 1985, you can read the whole thing in about 10 seconds. It was just tomatoes, water, salt, and natural flavoring, and that was essentially the original recipe. If you look at a label after 2000, you will see corn syrup and modified food starch, along with a much longer list of ingredients that are now doing the heavy lifting salt used to handle on its own. The phrase natural flavors is something you should really pay attention to because the FDA defines it broadly enough to cover a massive range of compounds. As long as a flavor-modifying chemical originates from a plant or animal source, at some point in the process, it can be tucked away under that vague label. What that phrase meant in a 1955 formula is nothing like what it represents today. And since it is a legal category rather than a specific recipe description, it gives manufacturers a lot of room to tweak the taste without changing the front of the package. We got the clearest proof that sodium was a flavor variable, and not just a health metric between 2011 and 2013. In 2011, Campbell's announced an aggressive campaign to cut salt across its soup lines as part of a major public health commitment, but the result was a noticeable drop in sales. Consumers knew something was wrong even if they could not quite put their finger on what had changed, and by 2013, the company had to reverse course and restore sodium to its previous levels. This was one of the most public admissions a food giant has ever made about the relationship between salt and how much we enjoy eating. And while they did not put out a press release saying the formula failed, The price correction told the story for them. The corn syrup side of this story follows a different set of pressures that started with the sugar price spikes of 1973 and 1974. Those spikes were driven by a global shortage and specific U.S. trade policies, which forced manufacturers to start replacing expensive cane sugar with high-fructose corn syrup wherever they could. This new sweetener was cheaper and sourced right here at home, and it functioned almost exactly like sucrose in most recipes. Campbell's followed the same cost-cutting logic that was moving through the rest of the processed food industry, and soon corn syrup was showing up in everything from soups and sauces to bread and canned goods. The soup you remember from the 1980s was already a product in the middle of a massive transition. It was not the high-sodium version from the 50s, and it was not the version after 2000 where corn syrup was filling the gaps left by salt reduction. It sat right in the middle of those two eras, catching the tail end of one reformulation and the very beginning of another. The taste memory most of us are reaching for does not actually map onto a single version of the product, because there was never one stable version to remember in the first place. Today, the formula sits at about 480 milligrams of sodium per serving. That is a huge drop from the historical highs of nearly 900. That difference is very real, and you can see it on the back of the can if you look for it. The corn syrup and the modified starch are sitting there too, waiting for anyone who decides to flip the can over and read past the big, bold numbers on the nutrition facts. Campbell's found themselves backed into a corner with no easy way out. They could have kept the sodium at those classic levels, but that meant facing constant regulatory pressure and a public health narrative that was only moving in one direction. If they cut the salt, they risked losing the specific flavor chemistry that defined the brand for decades, and every possible path forward came with a massive downside. Adding corn syrup was not just some lazy shortcut, it was the same fix the entire processed food industry adopted for the same reasons. Between the low cost and the easy availability, it solved a formulation problem that every major manufacturer was struggling with at the time. What we ended up with was a product designed for shelf life and regulatory compliance. But those corporate priorities rarely align with how a meal actually tastes. This is not a story about a corporate villain, but rather a look at what happens when government targets and ingredient economics collide with consumer expectations over a 40-year window. The company claims the recipe never officially changed, and while that might be technically accurate, it is also practically meaningless. The actual chemistry of the soup shifted at least twice over the last 40 years because of global forces that cared more about logistics than flavor. Even though the can looks the same and the name has not moved, the liquid inside is a different product entirely. If you want to understand why the foods you grew up with do not taste the way you remember, hit the subscribe button.